What if I told you that 30 days of fasting resets our brain? We have heard people say things like, after a few days of fasting, I suddenly thought more clearly, or I stopped obsessing about food and my anxiety went down. And then we have also heard people say things like, my brain fog just lifted. These aren't just anecdotes, they're real conversations happening all over Reddit and health communities where people they describe something almost unexpected about fasting. They talk about clarity, calm, focus, emotional steadiness, and mental resilience, things that they hadn't experienced in years. But a very few of us were told what fasting is actually doing inside of us. Why the first few days feel hard, why the middle feels strangely clear, and why by the end something about us it feels lighter, more patient, more present, and less reactive. Today I want to explore something fascinating, that what if fasting is not just a spiritual practice, but a reset, not only for the body, but for the brain itself. So let's explore that. Now, to understand how fasting resets us, we have to go back, not just back to biology, but back to the wisdom that came long before science, long before anyone spoke about metabolism or brain chemistry. Because fasting was never described as deprivation, it was described as conscious restraint. In the Quran, in Surah Al Baqarah, there is a line that says, fasting has been prescribed for you as it was prescribed for those before you, so that you may become mindful, not thinner, not weaker, not deprived, but mindful, aware, and present. To be aware of self, to be aware of our reactions, and to be aware of something greater than appetite. And interestingly, one of the earlier scriptures in the book of Bible, it echoes a similar wisdom. Is it not the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loosen the chains, to break the yoke, and to set the soul free? The Quran confirms these past messages, but also clarifies and completes them, that they are sent by the same God through different times and to different people, but always with one intention, which is to return us to awareness, to reshape the soul through restraint, and to remind us of the one who created hunger and then showed us how to rise above it. And this message, it echoes across centuries that fasting is not about performance. It is about release. It is a loosening of attachment, of compulsion, of ego. It is a sacred pause from constant consumption of food, stimulation, gratification, and even speech. Imam al-Ghazali once wrote in his book called Ihya Ulumuddin that the purpose of fasting is to weaken the soul's hold over desire, so that the heart may awaken to remembrance. And these weren't metaphors, they were observations of the soul. Because fasting, it teaches us something quietly radical, that we're not ruled by every urge. We can feel discomfort without collapsing. We can pause and still be okay. So long before science even caught up, timeless wisdom had already taught us what we constantly consume eventually consumes us. And what's even more astonishing is this, that the same truth the Quran revealed 1400 years ago, the science is only now beginning to measure. So let's step into the body and see what fasting is actually doing to the brain. The modern brain, as we all know, is overstimulated. We wake up and reach for our phones, flooded with notifications, news, sugar, screens, content. And with every swipe, every bite, every scroll, it spikes a reward chemical in the brain called dopamine. And over time, what happens is the brain stops responding. Like a muscle that's been overworked, the reward system, it just becomes numb. It takes more to feel joy, more to feel focused, and more to feel anything at all. And that is where fasting steps in. When we fast, not just from food, but from noise, from indulgence, the dopamine system, it begins to recalibrate. Pleasure thresholds, they reset. Simple things, they start to feel good again. And silence, it starts to feel good again. That's why we often hear people say things like, I am less anxious, or I can think more clearly, and I'm not chasing things as much. And believe me, it is not just dopamine, because around the second or the third day, the body begins what scientists call a metabolic switch. It starts shifting from burning sugar to burning ketones, which are a cleaner, more stable fuel for the brain. And what's even more fascinating is that in the fast described in the Quran, food and water both are withheld. This is called dry fasting, also known as absolute fasting. And scientists have found that this pushes the body in deeper autophagy. Fats, they break down faster, inflammation drops faster, and the brain, it shifts into clarity sooner. Because in the absence of external inputs, the body, it turns inward. It starts producing its own hydration, its own fuel. And this might explain why so many people, they describe an even sharper sense of focus when they are dry fasting. Because it is not deprivation, it is a deep reset. It reduces inflammation, it sharpens cognition, and it increases stress resilience. So the nervous system, it begins to settle. That's when emotional reactivity goes down, impulse control, it goes up, and behind the scenes, another shift happens, a rise in something called BDNF, which is the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a neurochemical that is widely expressed in the central nervous system, our gut, and other tissues. And this neurochemical, it supports learning, memory, and neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to rewire itself. So in other words, the same thing ancient texts call remembrance or awareness, science now sees as measurable biological change. That fasting does not just quiet the stomach, it quiets the noise in the brain and strengthens the gut-brain connection. And somehow, in that stillness, new awareness begins to rise. And to add on, there is something oddly beautiful about all this. Spirituality tells us that restraint brings clarity, hunger softens the ego, and stillness opens awareness. And science now echoes that overstimulation exhausts the brain. Fasting restores regulation, and that is when clarity comes, when the noise calms down. And it's as simple as that. One speaks in verses, the other in chemicals, but both are pointing to the same truth, that fasting works not because we suffer, but because we stop overstimulating ourselves. Our body slows down, the brain resets, the soul listens. And that is exactly why people come and say that I feel calmer, or my prayers, they feel deeper. And it is not magic, it is not placebo, it is a biological and spiritual awakening of how we were always meant to live, which is not in constant reaction, not in constant noise, but in rhythm, in mindful restraint, and being aware of the divine. Now let's talk about what 30 days of fasting actually teach us. Because most people can fast for a day, a few can do it for a week, but something changes when you do it for 30 days. Because 30 days is not just a break, it is a pattern, a rhythm, and a retraining. Scientists, they call it neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to rewire itself through repeated behavior. But anyone who's fasted for a month knows it is not just the brain that changes, it is us. We lose with our cravings, they lose power, our emotions, they become quieter, and the need to constantly respond, it fades away. And then what's left is something sturdier, more patience, more presence, less impulsivity, and more intention. And I believe this is what fasting teaches us, not how to escape the world, but how to walk through it with steadiness. It's as if the body remembers the hunger, but the soul, it strives for balance, and then it settles in balance. And an interesting modern discovery of some physicists, they say that the universe may be shaped by observation, and that consciousness changes reality. So maybe fasting sharpens that consciousness. Maybe when we detach, we're not just resetting biology, we're realigning with something bigger than biology, a field, a pattern, and a presence. And so it brings me to this beautiful recognition that maybe this was not random. Maybe the one who asked us to fast understood the mind better than we ever could. The one who asked us to fast understood how overstimulation grounds clarity and how silence and restraint heals. And maybe fasting wasn't given to us as a test, but as a gift, a quiet ritual, not to make us weaker, but to make us whole again, in our body, in our brain, and in our spirit. And somewhere in that stillness, we begin to remember that the design was always wise, and that the one who made us also knew how to reset us. If you like this video, it is a humble reminder that Ramadan is coming up. It is a sacred month, and it is when Muslims around the world, they fast from dawn to the dusk. So this is your chance to fast, reset your mind, your body, and your soul, and feel whole again. Thank you.